Okay, this is a review for the end of Unit 7, the part that we stopped at to study for the last term exam. We have this slide on the PowerPoint. That's the point where you begin studying again so that we can finish it effectively. So, you'll remember, we began with part 5, which were the crises of the 14th century, leading us into the modern age. So, economic crisis caused by bad harvest, a bad harvest causes famine, and famine causes high mortality. Basically, obviously, when there's not enough food, many people die. A much bigger problem, however, was the Black Death and other epidemics that were similar and came at the same time, right? We learned in the video there are actually two kinds of Black Death, the pneumonic plague and the bubonic plague that tended to travel together. Important things to know from this, things that we saw from the video that are very, very basic. You do not have to go back and watch the documentary again. Things like, what continent did it come from? It came from Asia. How was it spread? Through fleas that bit rats and then jumped onto humans and bit the humans, right? 1/3 of Europe's population died in one go. And then the plague came back several times every few years, right? We have wars like the 100 Years' War, that we'll see now. Some film from the Black Hole. Okay. 100 Years' War. You don't need to know all of the details of the 100 Years' War, okay? You need to know the big picture, understand the big idea of what happened, okay? Big important question. Who fought in the 100 Years' War? England versus France. Then you had allies, right? Portugal, we know, allied with England, and Spain allied with France, right? Or Castile, as it was at the time. So, why did it happen? The important thing you need to know is that it was a disagreement about the inheritance of territory in France, right? About who was going to be the king of France. Why? Because they had an interesting situation where, and this is not in your PowerPoint, but I just want to illustrate it here. You have France, and you have a duchy, which you'll remember is the territory of a duke. So, un ducado, right, from un duque, a duchy, the territory of a duke. And the duke, in this case, is the king of England. And if the duke, in an area of France, is the king of England, that means that the king of England is a vassal of the king of France. Meaning that the king of France is the lord of the king of England, which is not a common situation. But it does bring up a big problem when the king of France dies without an heir, because we had King Philip III of France, and normally we have King Philip IV of France, and everything's going in the normal order. Then we have Charles IV, right? The other two are already dead at this point, so forget about them. Charles IV dies, and all he has is a sister, right? And the sister marries Edward II of England. And from there, they have a son. So, the English side wants Edward III of England to become king of France for two reasons. It's good to have your king be kings of several countries, and more importantly, because they're sick of this situation where the king of England is somehow always below the king of France, right? Because if the king of England is the vassal of the king of France and then becomes the king of France, well, obviously you can't be a vassal or a lord to yourself, so there's no more problem. But this line of inheritance includes a woman, right? You're passing the inheritance of the throne on through the mother, not through the father. The father is English. He doesn't have the crown of France. So this, at this time, was not necessarily considered an acceptable way to pass on the throne. This is what the English side wanted, right? The French side said, no, we can't find anyone here, we can't find anyone here. So usually what you have to do with inheritance is you have to go back up your family tree and go back down until you can find the closest relative, maybe a nephew, maybe a cousin, right? So they found down this way, Philip IV. They want to be Philip IV or Philip, and they want to be Philip IV of France, king, okay? So, you don't need to know all the details of that, be able to produce it, but you do need to be able to recognize it, okay? Then we have some detail about exactly how the war went. France was better at first, then it went on for 116 years, so we're not going to study every little change in the war. But France was stronger at first, then they brought in the allies, Portugal with England, as I said, and Castile with France, right? The most famous part of the war began when Henry V of England invaded France and won the Battle of Agincourt with many bowmen. The bowmen had the English longbow, which is famous from this war as being our big advantage and having a big military advance in technology that later continued on, right? And of course, we have a big turning point when Joan of Arc comes in, because she successfully leads the siege of Orleans, right, kind of turning the tides of the battle where this little girl convinces the whole English army to surrender, right? And then we saw in the preview and the scene of her death that she ended up in the hands of the English, right? They manipulated her spiritual faith and said that she was a witch, that she wasn't really talking to God, that she was hearing voices, she was crazy, she was a witch, right? And they ended up burning her at the stake. Remember we saw the film where they tie her to that post and they burn her alive, right? That's all that you need to know about the 100 Years' War, nothing else. Other social conflicts, remember you have the petite bourgeoisie, which is the lower bourgeoisie, revolting against the high bourgeoisie, right? So you're starting to have, already in history, now that you have city classes, you're having conflicts between the two. And beggars, the people who are on the street asking for money, and bandits, who are thieves, are also increasing. So you're having some sort of some problems developing the city. The other thing here, you had a big crisis in the church that's called the Western Schism. I gave you all these details because it explains a lot, but don't worry about them for the exam, okay? All I need you to know is that, because there's just so many details, you could go on pages and pages and pages. The important part is, it's an internal split that caused there to be 2 and then later 3 popes at once. So you had Catholic people trying to be loyal to the Catholic Church, very confused and not knowing which pope to follow. You had different countries following different popes. So you had mixed messages coming from everywhere. And it was a big, I mean, you have to remember, the Catholic Church is still important, but in that time, it was the most important thing in the world. So people felt very, very lost, not knowing who to have confidence in, right? And then eventually we get into the modern age where you have some things that lead to a recovery. So you have good harvests. Remember we saw in the film about the Dark Ages, at the end of the Dark Ages, the temperature rose about 1 degree, and that helped turn non-arable land into arable land, so you could get more food. Kings managed to assert their power over the nobility and the high bourgeoisie. The way they did this, we saw in Unit 8, was through establishing parliaments, the cortes, where they gave these people representation, so they didn't feel like so much like they had to just obey the king, right? The king let them have arguments and vote and have a small amount of power to kind of keep them happy and keep them not revolting against him. A new way of thinking emerged. You need to know what humanism is, okay? This is important and I expect you to be able to explain it, right? I'll read it first and then we'll talk about it. Humanism is a group of philosophies and ethical perspectives which emphasize the value and agency of human beings, individually and collectively, and generally prefers individual thought and evidence, which is rationalism and empiricism, over established doctrine or faith. This change led way for the Renaissance, which we're going to study later, which is a rebirth in classical culture. But what's important here is individual thought, that you don't just believe what you're told, right, no matter who it's coming from. You try to rationally think about it and see if it makes sense to you. And if you really want to have something as truth, you try to prove it empirically. Empirical evidence is evidence you can see and touch, right? That you can prove in a scientific experiment, for example. It would say that Newton discovered gravity by watching an apple fall from a tree. That's empirical evidence that you can observe. It's not something you have to have faith in. So this was a big change from the way people thought before, which was only influenced by religion. And remember, people couldn't even read the Bible for themselves, for example, right? You had a priest who told you what was in the Bible. He explained to you and he told you what to do, right? So you followed a traditional way of thinking. And this is a new way of thinking that's much more individualistic, right? You kind of have to discover things for yourself. Okay. I'm not kind of going along with that. You have Gutenberg inventing the printing press. People don't talk about it a lot, but this is probably the most important invention until we got to the internet. It's basically the equivalent of the internet. It's a complete change in how information is stored, manipulated, used, shared, right? It changes everything. Why? Because books could be printed, reproduced cheaply, easily, and then spread. It used to be that before this, you had monks. First of all, pretty much the only book that was reproduced was the Bible because you didn't have time for anything else because it took so long. You had to, with calligraphy, paints, books, wait for the page to dry, do it perfectly. Made a mistake, woof, start over, right? Just terrible. It just took so long, almost nobody bothered to learn to read because there was only one book anyway, and they told you what was in it. Okay? All of this brought us from medieval society into the modern age.